There is a photograph taken at the Nuremberg rally of 1934, an aerial shot captured by Leni Riefenstahl's camera crew that shows something simultaneously magnificent and terrifying in its geometric precision. 130,000 human beings arranged in perfect rectangular formations stretching across the Zeppelinfeld, their bodies aligned with mathematical exactitude, moving in absolute synchronization as searchlights pierce the night sky in columns so bright and so precisely spaced that Albert Speer, who designed the lighting, called it a cathedral of light, a temple built from nothing but illumination and the massed bodies of people who had surrendered their individual will to become components in a vast machine of collective identity. From above, these people cease to be individuals with faces and names and private thoughts and become instead a living symbol, a visual representation of unity and power and submission, so complete that watching the footage even decades later produces a visceral response that bypasses rational analysis and speaks directly to something primal in human psychology, something that responds to displays of collective strength and coordinated movement with a mixture of awe and fear that our conscious minds struggle to articulate or resist. The Nazi regime understood something profound and disturbing about human cognition and social behavior, something that psychologists and neuroscientists are only now beginning to fully map and explain through research into how symbols and rituals hijack the brain's processing systems, how visual imagery and synchronized movement and carefully orchestrated spectacle can override the prefrontal cortex's capacity for critical analysis and create emotional and behavioral responses that feel automatic and irresistible. They discovered through intuition and experimentation what we now know through brain imaging studies and behavioral research, that human beings are fundamentally symbolic creatures whose identities and loyalties and moral frameworks are shaped more by imagery and ritual and tribal affiliation than by rational argument or ethical reasoning, that we can be programmed through repetition and emotional conditioning to associate certain symbols with feelings of belonging and power and righteousness, while associating others with disgust and fear and the impulse to destroy. Welcome to Forgotten Minds. Today, we dissect the architecture of symbolic manipulation, examining how the Nazi regime engineered a comprehensive system of flags and uniforms and rituals and spectacles that transformed ordinary Germans into components of a totalitarian organism, exploring the specific psychological mechanisms through which symbols bypass rational thought and create the conditions for mass obedience and collective atrocity, and recognizing that these mechanisms remain active and available in any society that chooses to employ them, because the vulnerabilities they exploit are wired into human neurology and social psychology in ways that transcend any particular historical moment or cultural context. The swastika itself, that ancient symbol appropriated and transformed by Nazi ideology, demonstrates with perfect clarity how visual imagery can be weaponized to produce psychological and behavioral effects that far exceed what any written argument or logical proposition could achieve. The symbol's design contains specific visual properties that make it psychologically potent. The sharp angles and dynamic rotation suggest movement and energy and aggressive force. The stark black, white, red color scheme creates maximum visual contrast and triggers immediate attention responses in the visual cortex. The geometric simplicity makes it instantly recognizable and easy to reproduce, allowing it to be deployed everywhere and at every scale, from massive banners to tiny lapel pins, saturating the visual environment until it becomes impossible to look anywhere without encountering it, until it achieves the status of visual omnipresence that religions reserve for images of their deities. The Nazis deployed this symbol with strategic sophistication that reveals deep intuitive understanding of how repeated exposure to imagery creates neural pathways and emotional associations that become automatic and unconscious. The swastika appeared on flags that dominated every public building and filled the sky at rallies, on armbands worn by party members that mark them as belonging to the powerful in-group, on uniforms and vehicles, and official documents and propaganda posters, creating what psychologists call environmental saturation, where a symbol becomes so pervasive in the visual field that the brain begins processing it as simply part of the background reality of existence, as natural and inevitable as the sun rising in the east. This saturation achieves something crucial for authoritarian control. It makes the ideology, the symbol, represents him not like one political perspective among many, but like an objective feature of reality itself, like something that simply is, rather than something that some people believe and others reject. The flag ceremonies and rituals that surrounded these symbols amplified their psychological power through what we now understand as Pavlovian conditioning and emotional imprinting. When the swastika flag was raised, specific behaviors were mandated. Standing at attention, extending the right arm in salute, maintaining silence or singing prescribed anthems, participating in synchronized movements that aligned your body with the bodies of everyone around you. These rituals were repeated countless times. In schools every morning, at public gatherings, at party meetings, at the beginning of concerts and sporting events and theatre performances, until the symbol itself became a trigger for automatic bodily responses and emotional states, until seeing the swastika produced immediate feelings of arousal and group solidarity and readiness for action without any conscious deliberation about what that symbol represented, or whether the ideology behind it deserved loyalty or allegiance. The uniforms that Nazi hierarchy designed and deployed created visual hierarchies that made power relations immediately legible and established identity categories that overrode previous social structures and affiliations. The SS all-black uniform, with its death's head insignia and silver trim, communicated danger and elite status and separation from ordinary humanity, creating an identity for those who wore it that superseded their previous identities as Germans or Christians or members of particular families and professions. The various insignia and badges and medals created a complex visual language of rank and achievement and specialization that allowed insiders to immediately assess relative status and outsiders to feel the weight of hierarchical complexity that they could sense without fully understanding, producing the psychological effect that anthropologists have observed in societies with elaborate ritual systems. The sense that you are surrounded by knowledge and power structures that exceed your comprehension, that you are small and ignorant in the presence of something vast and organized and implacable. But carefully choreographed performances designed to produce specific psychological states in participants and spectators, engineered experiences that employed every tool of theatrical manipulation and crowd psychology to dissolve individual consciousness into collective identity and create emotional bonds to the regime that bypassed and overwhelmed rational assessment of its policies or moral evaluation of its actions. The Nuremberg rallies in particular represented the perfection of this manipulative art, with every element calculated to produce maximum psychological impact through the orchestration of space and light and sound and synchronized human movement. The architecture of the rally grounds itself was designed to manipulate perception and emotion, vast open spaces that made individuals feel small and insignificant, while making the mass crowd feel powerful and infinite. Massive stone structures that communicated permanence and immovability and connection to ancient civilizations and their monuments. Precise geometric layouts that created visual order and made the crowd itself into a work of living architecture. Albert Speer's use of searchlights to create vertical columns of light, extending thousands of feet into the night sky, produced what witnesses described as a quasi-religious experience, a sense of being inside a cathedral or temple whose walls were made of light itself, whose scale exceeded anything in normal human experience and produced feelings of transcendence and connection to something larger than individual existence. The timing and pacing of these events followed principles that religious ceremonies and theatrical performances have employed for millennia. The building of tension through waiting and anticipation. The synchronized movements that align individual bodies into collective patterns and produce through proprioceptive feedback. The sensation that you are part of a single organism rather than an isolated individual. The call and response chanting that creates rhythmic unity and makes your voice indistinguishable from the voices around you. The carefully orchestrated crescendos where music and movement and lighting all intensify simultaneously to produce emotional peaks that feel ecstatic and overwhelming. These techniques work because human nervous systems are wired for synchronization, because moving and speaking and breathing in rhythm with others produces neurochemical changes, including release of oxytocin and endorphins, that create feelings of bonding and euphoria and trust. Because losing yourself in a crowd engaged in synchronized behavior produces an altered state of consciousness where critical thinking shuts down and group identity becomes primary. The speeches that Hitler and other Nazi leaders delivered at these rallies employed rhetorical techniques designed to intensify these effects. The building from quiet to shouting that creates emotional arousal and makes the content feel urgent and significant, regardless of whether the actual words convey meaningful information. The repetition of simple phrases and slogans that bypass analytical processing and lodge in memory through pure frequency of exposure. The use of enemies and threats to activate fear and aggression that the crowd can then discharge through collective displays of loyalty and determination. The content of these speeches was often vague and contradictory when examined through rational analysis, filled with promises that could not be simultaneously fulfilled and claims that contradicted observable reality. Yet the emotional experience of hearing them delivered in this context was so powerful that participants remembered them as profound and inspiring, as moments of revelation and transformation that confirmed their loyalty and intensified their commitment. The psychological mechanisms that allowed these symbols and rituals to exert such comprehensive control over behavior and belief operate through pathways in human cognition and social psychology that evolution has built into our species because they serve survival functions in ancestral environments, but that can be hijacked and exploited by anyone who understands how they work and is willing to employ them for manipulation rather than for legitimate social coordination. Social identity theory explains how people derive significant portions of their self-concept and self-esteem from the groups they belong to, how threats to group status or cohesion are experienced as threats to personal identity and responded to with defensive aggression, how in-group favoritism and out-group derogation emerge automatically from the simple fact of categorization into groups regardless of any actual differences or conflicts of interest between those groups. The Nazi symbolic system exploited these tendencies by creating highly salient and emotionally charged group identities through visual markers and ritual participation, by making German and Aryan identity hypervisible through flags and uniforms and synchronized displays, while making Jewish and other targeted identities visible through forced badges and restrictions that mark them as outside the protected in-group. Once these identity categories were established and reinforced through constant symbolic reminders and ritual performance, psychological research shows that a cascade of automatic cognitive biases activates. Conformity bias makes people align their stated beliefs and behaviors with perceived group consensus. Even when their private judgments differ, authority bias makes directives from recognized leaders seem more legitimate and worthy of obedience, regardless of their actual moral or practical merit. Tribal belonging creates emotional investment in group success and willingness to sacrifice for group goals, even when those goals conflict with individual interests or moral principles. The repetition and ubiquity of Nazi symbols and rituals created what psychologists call availability cascades, where ideas and associations become mentally accessible simply through frequent exposure, regardless of their validity or importance, where the ease with which something comes to mind when triggered by environmental cues is misinterpreted by the brain as evidence of its truth or significance. When you see swastikas everywhere, when you participate in flag ceremonies daily, when you attend massive rallies where hundreds of thousands of people perform synchronized loyalty displays, your brain builds neural networks that associate these symbols with power and belonging and moral rightness through pure frequency of co-occurrence, through the same mechanisms that build brand recognition in commercial advertising or create superstitious associations between unrelated events that happen to occur together repeatedly. The dissolution of individual moral judgment that these processes produced was comprehensive and operates through mechanisms that remain poorly understood by most people even today, which is why similar techniques continue to be employed successfully by authoritarian movements and commercial manipulators and anyone else who benefits from populations that respond to symbolic triggers rather than to rational analysis of actual circumstances and consequences. When your identity becomes fused with group identity through ritual and symbol, when your emotional states are conditioned to respond automatically to flags and anthems and displays of collective strength, when your daily environment is saturated with imagery that creates constant activation of tribal belonging circuits in your brain, the capacity for independent moral reasoning atrophies through simple lack of use, through the same neuroplasticity principles that allow unused skills to degrade while practiced behaviors become automatic and effortless. The Nazi symbolic system was eventually destroyed along with the regime that created it, The flags were burned and the uniforms discarded, and the massive rally grounds were allowed to crumble into ruins that now serve as museums and memorials to the dangers of what these techniques can produce when employed by malevolent powers with totalitarian ambitions. Yet the psychological mechanisms that allowed these symbols and rituals to exert such comprehensive control over German society in the 1930s and 1940s remain fully operational in human neurology and social psychology, remain available to be exploited by any movement or government or commercial interest that understands how they work and is willing to employ them for manipulation rather than for legitimate purposes of social coordination or cultural expression. Every society employs symbols and rituals to create shared identity and coordinate collective action, to mark boundaries between insiders and outsiders, to communicate values and histories and aspirations that cannot be easily conveyed through logical argument or written rules. Flags and anthems and ceremonies serve genuine functions in creating the social cohesion that allows large groups of strangers to cooperate and trust each other and make sacrifices for collective welfare. The question that the Nazi case forces upon us is how to distinguish between legitimate symbolic systems that serve genuine human needs for belonging and meaning, and manipulative symbolic systems designed to override critical thinking and create the conditions for atrocity and oppression. How to maintain the capacity for independent moral judgment while also participating in the collective identities and ritual practices that make civilization possible. Human beings will always be vulnerable to symbolic manipulation because we are fundamentally symbolic creatures whose cognition and social behavior depend on shared systems of meaning that exist primarily through imagery and ritual rather than through logical argument. What protects against the Nazi use of this vulnerability is awareness of how it operates. Cultivation of the metacognitive capacity to recognize when symbols are being employed to bypass rather than to inform rational judgment. Maintenance of spaces and practices and relationships that exist outside the symbolic systems that dominant powers seek to impose. And collective commitment to preserving the possibility of dissent and alternative identities, even when conformity would be emotionally easier and socially rewarded. This has been forgotten minds. The swastika no longer flies over Germany. The rallies no longer fill the Nuremberg grounds. The uniforms have been relegated to museums and film archives. Yet the techniques they embodied remain waiting in the toolkit of manipulation available to anyone who seeks comprehensive control over human behavior and belief, and recognizing those techniques when they begin to appear in new forms under different flags is perhaps the only reliable defense against their re-emergence. Until next time, stay vigilant.